Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Jesus has suggested to the disciples that they travel across the Sea of Galilee to the other side by boat. Now, since a whole bunch of the disciples are fishermen, that's an easy enough thing to arrange and a safe enough thing to do, you would think. But right from the beginning, the disciples might be just a little bit anxious because Jesus says he wants to go to the other side of the lake. Now, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee are the Gentiles, foreigners. It's foreign land. It's not friendly territory. So already the disciples might be thinking, okay, what are we going there for? But they are leaving the crowds behind, so that's good. And Jesus goes to sleep in the boat. He's getting a bit of rest. That's good. But then a storm whips up. Apparently, that's quite normal on the Sea of Galilee. They can just come out of nowhere. And although we call it the Sea of Galilee, it's a lake, but it's a pretty big lake, so the weather can be a real factor. The waves beat into the boat, and the boat is being swamped. And Jesus, well, he's asleep in the stern. Now, when Mark's community hear this story told, they will immediately think of the story of Jonah from the Hebrew Scriptures. So we need to kind of go in our minds to Jonah as well. If you don't know the story, God asked Jonah to go to a place called Nineveh, where he was to preach against the people, and Jonah did not want to go there at all. And so he goes in the opposite direction and hops in a boat and sails away. And then, of course, there's a huge storm, and Jonah is asleep. And the captain of the boat comes to wake Jonah up and says, pray to your God, little g, because we've all prayed to our gods and the storm is not stopping, so why don't you pray to your God and stop the storm? And that doesn't work. And then Jonah confesses that actually he's fleeing from his God. And so the sailors say, well, that's obviously while we're in a storm, and they throw him overboard. And that's when he gets swallowed up by the whale, and the whale part of the story carries on. So when the disciples wake Jesus and say, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? We're supposed to think in our minds also of Jonah. But the disciples actually seem more concerned about Jesus' indifference to the fact that the storm is swamping their boat than they do about the storm. They don't have any expectation that Jesus is going to fix the storm. They rather just think he should be caring a bit more about what's about to happen to them. Do you not care that we are perishing? And our Old Testament reading that Harry read from Job this morning has a similar cry in it. God, do you not care? As Harry said, it's a great read to read the book of Job. If you've never read it, it's a ripper of a read. It's all about suffering and being afflicted with a lot of calamities. And Job, through it, first of all, does not complain, and then in the end, demands account from God. He demands that God appear to testify like in a courtroom. He demands to know what is going on. And God's response is the piece of the passage that we heard today. God says, who are you, Job, to question me? Where were you when I was creating the world? Where were you when I was controlling the seas? So Mark's community will think of Job as well as Jonah when they hear today's story. But still, the disciples do not expect Jesus to do anything about the storm because they still do not understand who he is. But Mark's community do know. And so with the echoes here of Jonah and Job and also the creation story and the psalm that we heard, there's a sense for the disciples of Jesus' time and for Mark's community. They understand God and have understood God for generations and centuries as being in control of nature. That's the kind of worldview that they have. They understand that God created the world and God can create storms or not. It's not quite the way we see the world these days, but that's where Mark's community would have been when they hear this story. And then, of course, Mark's community also know the end of the Jesus story, but the disciples don't. And so there they are, kind of looking back, watching the disciples and thinking, how could you not figure this out? But back in the story in real time, if you like, Jesus rebukes the wind. and rebukes the wind just like he would rebuke a demon in Mark's Gospel. And he says to the sea, "Be still." Now, of course, this does not reassure the disciples at all. They're even more afraid now, wouldn't you be, if someone you were in a boat with could command the storm to be still? They know that God alone can do this, from the stories of Jonah and Job and from the Psalms. God alone can control the forces of nature. So who is this Jesus? And Jesus says to them, quite puzzled, "Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid of the storm? And why are you even more afraid now that the storm is gone?" This dialogue that they have, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And then the response, "Why are you afraid?" Is that not also our dialogue with God? Do you not care, God, that children are in prison, that millions are starving, that violence reigns? Do you not care, we say? And God's answer in this passage is, "Why are you afraid?" Or maybe, "Why do you always start from a place of fear?" Which doesn't really seem to be a satisfactory answer. When I was in London recently at the International Network meeting just this last month, our group was very privileged to meet the new Bishop of London, Bishop Sarah Mullally. She's the first woman to be the Bishop of London, and a woman, funnily enough, we think, following along from Bishop Richard Chartres, who always refused to ordain women. So it's kind of like God has got a sense of humour, appointing a woman to follow him. So we were asking her about, how's it going? She was like 2 weeks into the job. And she said to us, if we operate out of a place of fear, then we miss the creativity of the Holy Spirit. If you operate out of a place of fear, then you're going to miss the creativity of the Holy Spirit. So think about that as we think about why we might be afraid. What are we afraid of in our daily lives? Are we afraid of failure? Are we afraid of being vulnerable? Are we afraid of losing face? Are we afraid of losing a loved one? Or being judged? Or not having enough money? Or losing our home? Being found wanting? Are we afraid of another person, a bully at work or at home? Are we afraid of getting sick? Are we afraid of dying? Fear is used in our world also too often by our world leaders. Haven't we seen that in the last couple of weeks? Fear of immigrants, fear of crime, fear of the other, fear of those who live on the other side of the lake or the other side of the border. And Jesus says to our personal fears and to our world fears, "Why are you afraid? Do not be dominated and driven by fear. Cast out that fear and receive instead peace and stillness." The peace and stillness of the becalmed lake. There's an amazing documentary on Netflix at the moment that some of you might have seen called Attack on Paris. It recounts the terrible series of attacks in November 2015, including the Bataclan nightclub attack. It was that night when there were many attacks across Paris. And the documentary is a series of interviews with people recalling the night's terrible events and their fear and their terror and their trauma. But at the end of watching the series, you're not left with a sense of fear at all, but a sense of the amazing dignity and the amazing strength of the survivors. In the way they tell their story, you witness their ability to process and to reflect with incredible eloquence what happened to them that night. They might have been afraid that night, but they are certainly no longer afraid. They are very strong, and there is a peace and a stillness about them which is quite remarkable. In the midst of the attacks, they certainly cried to God or to anyone who would listen, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" But they are no longer afraid. So in our boats, in our storms, we cry out to God, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And Jesus says, "Be still, receive peace, and do not be afraid."